Magic is part and parcel to fantasy, and with a game as detailed as the Dark Eye, you can reasonably expect there to be a lot of options. So let's go ahead and explore those options, shall we? The first thing I want to make clear is this. While I'll use the term magic through most of this video, a lot of the magic rules also apply to Liturgy, the special powers of the Blessed Ones. The basics remain mostly the same between magic and liturgical chants. The only real difference is that magic uses arcane energy, requires that a caster take a tradition of magic, and requires the advantaged spellcaster. Meanwhile, Liturgy uses karma points, requires the character to take a liturgical tradition, and requires the advantaged Blessed One. In other words, they're distinctly different aspects of the game. Just because you're one does not necessarily mean you are the other. Despite that though, they both use many of the same rules. So when I say magic or spell, what I'm saying could also apply to liturgy and liturgical chant. Wherever the two differ though, I'll be sure to say so. Magic in the Dark Eye is, in a way, treated very similarly to mundane skill rolls. That is, every spell has 3 attributes associated with it, and your aim is to roll beneath or at those numbers. You also have a rating for each spell that grants you skill points. These allow you to lower your rolls of your dice should they be too high, and any unused points raise the overall effectiveness of the end result. This means that much like skills, having the right attributes is just as important for spellcasting as having a high skill rating for it. Magic has a few slight differences from mundane skills that are worth making note of. First, having skill points left over is much more important when you're casting magic. Higher quality levels almost always grant a stronger end result. Additionally, the cost for gaining spells is slightly higher. Before you can invest skill points in a spell, you first need to pay for an activation cost. And much like skills, each spell also has an improvement cost associated with it, which also affects the activation cost, per the chart on page 400. So to bring it all together, if a mage wants to learn the spell Balsam Salabund on page 288 and raise the rank to 4, they would need to spend 2 points to activate it, and then 8 to raise it 4 levels, for a total of 10 points since the spell has an improvement rating of B. Another example, if a Blessed One wanted to learn Divine Guidance on page 326 and then raise it to rank 7, they would spend 1 point to activate it and then 7 more to raise it to rank 7, costing a total of 8 points due to its improvement rating of A. Using magic follows 6 simple steps. First, you choose the target, which is simple enough, and most of the details are listed in the spell block. You're looking for the target being in range and being of the appropriate type, listed in the target category. Second step is to apply spell modifications. This is one of the coolest things about magic in the Dark Eye. Unless a spell listing says otherwise, you can modify various parts of the spell by raising the cost of casting it. There's a limit of only allowing 1 modification to a spell for every 4 full points you have in the skill rating of it, so you can't get too crazy with modifying spells. This is probably for the best though, since modifications typically impose penalties to casting the spell. The general rule for how the modifications work is that anything that makes it more effective either costs more in energy or time. The specifics can be found on page 255 for magic or 309 for liturgy. The third step is to perform the casting. This is the step where the character actually performs the hand gestures and recites the word associated with the spell. For spells that only take 1 action, this step doesn't really mean much. However, for those that take multiple actions, also known as a long action, this is where the caster invests that time in casting the spell. If for whatever reason they're interrupted, they then need to make a self-control check, with failure on this roll causing the spell to fail. A caster could also willingly end the spell before it's cast at this point as well, but it still counts as a failed spell in this case. Fourth step is you make the check for the spell. After the required amount of time is spent casting the spell, you make the skill check for the spell to see if you succeed. This works like any other skill check. Roll 1 die for each of the 3 associated attributes, and you get your skill ranking in the spell to modify the rolls. Any leftover skill points determine quality level. The fifth step is you subtract the energy for the spell. For spells, this refers to arcane energy, while for liturgical chants, it refers to karma points. The cost of a spell is listed in its description and can be modified in step 2. If for any reason it fails, such as being interrupted, abandoning before making the check, or not succeeding in the check, you still spend half the energy you would need for the spell. And the 6th and final step is to determine the effect. This is exactly what it sounds like. Whatever the spell does, happens. Let's have an example with the spell Invocation listed on page 293. The target category for this spell is all, so anything we can see, we can theoretically blast with this. It has a casting time of 2 turns, but I want to throw my firebolt as soon as possible, so I'm going to modify its casting time down by 1 level, causing it to have a -1 penalty to the roll for this spell. Since we've reduced it to 1 action, we don't need to worry about step 3. Next, we make the skill roll for it, based on our courage, sagacity, and charisma. Let's assume my character has a courage of 12, a sagacity of 14, and a charisma of 12, and the skill rating they have for this spell is 8. After applying the -1 penalty, we're looking for rolls under 11, 13, and 11. If our rolls happen to be 8, 16, and 11, we'll need to use 3 of our skill points to bring that 16 down to 13, giving us a final amount of skill points equal to 5. This is enough for 2 quality levels. Then we deduct our 8 arcane energy for casting the spell and apply its effects. In this case, our target is struck with a lance made of fire, dealing 2 times the quality level plus 2d6 damage to the target, which they then may roll to defend against if they're capable of defending against ranged attacks. Rituals are spells that a mage can cast that take a little bit longer and more energy than their faster cousins. Rituals serve a few specific purposes in the Dark Eye. They can be used for conjuring otherworldly creatures or creating magical items. True to the recurring theme of the Dark Eye, both of these functions of rituals are built around the existing mechanics. Let's start with Invocation, the rituals for bringing in otherworldly creatures into ours. There's Summoning, which deals with demons, and Calling, which deals with the elements. Mechanically, the 2 are more or less the same and follow similar progressions. There's the spell Invocation Minima, which calls forth substances from the nether hells like slime, acid, or other nasty stuff. And then you have Manifesto, which produces small amounts of the elements, like a fist-sized stone or a block of ice. These aren't rituals, but before a character can learn their respective rituals, they need to have a skill rating of 10 in these spells. Afterwards, they can learn the rituals Invocation Minor or Elemental Servant, which bring forth weak but sapient creatures of their respective spheres. And once a mage has a rating of 12 in one of these, they can learn the next step along their path, Invocation Mayor for demons or Call Jin for elements. As for the actual steps, they're as follows. First is preparations. This is where magic circles are drawn, as well as any protective or warding circles the mage wishes to use. Protective and warding circles are a special ability that a mage needs to acquire separately, and they're technically optional, but forgoing these typically ends in disaster. As an additional cost for conjuring elementals, some of their preferred element is needed. Minor spirits might need something like a campfire or a bucket of water, but a massive fountain would be required to summon a djinn of water. The second step is making the roll. The list of modifiers for making the roll isn't quite as straightforward with spells. There's a list of modifiers on page 260 that apply to all rituals, as well as a modifier for each individual creature that can be summoned in the bestiary section between pages 355 and 359. Third step is to check the results of the check. If the check succeeds, the quality of the skill level determines 2 things: what sort of enhancements the conjured creature can have, as well as how many tasks the creature will perform for them. This is also where your AE for the ritual is spent. Upon failure, you only lose half of the arcane energy that would be spent, and regarding to elementals, that's the end of your misfortune. That's not necessarily the case for anyone willing to risk dealing with demons. In addition to the loss of arcane energy, there is a table that's rolled on by the GM that could cause all manner of horrific things to happen. Or if you're lucky, nothing will happen. And finally, after all that, the conjured creature will perform the services that they are asked. After you've succeeded on the roll and you've decided the enhancements you want on the creature, you then get to decide what they do. There is a list of different kinds of services they can perform listed between pages 264 and 265. The amount of services they'll offer is always at least one, but you get more based on how many quality levels you have left over after using enhancements. Magic can be imbued into an item as well. This uses the Arcanovi and Spellblade rituals. Spellblade is the simpler of the two. After performing the 8-hour-long ritual, a weapon is considered to be magical. All this really does is allow for a weapon to deal normal amounts of damage to demons and elementals, who would otherwise only take half damage from mundane weapons. Arcanovi is the ritual for creating magical items that can recreate spell effects. These are your magical wands and rings and other such things from other games. The core rulebook only holds rules for two kinds of artifacts: spell storage and self-charging. Both varieties allow a spell to be put into an object and to be used at a later time, though the self-charging variety can regain their power over time, allowing for more uses. To create such an item, the mage needs to know the spell they wish to store, and then to use the Arcanovi ritual. The roll for this ritual is modified by the modifiers on page 260, as well as how many uses of the spell they wish to store. Each additional use beyond the first imposes a cumulative -1 penalty. The amount of arcane energy spent is not only the cost of Arcanovi, but also the cost for each individual casting of the spell that's going to be stored. Then you make the roll for Arcanovi, and if that succeeds, the mage must then cast the spell to be stored. When creating an artifact, make a note of how many skill points are left for the spell to be stored. This becomes important when someone is using this artifact. Should either of these rolls fail, the entire ritual fails, and half of the total of all energy that would be invested is lost. Should it succeed though, as one final cost to make the artifact, 10% of the arcane energy spent is lost permanently. Creating artifacts is a very draining experience. To use a stored spell requires a free action, and either a special gesture or magic word to be spoken, followed by a magic check. The skill rating of the spell cast is equal to the number of skill points left over when it was cast during creation, but the attributes rolled against are all 14. Self-charging artifacts are created in the same fashion, but with a few extra caveats. Based on how often the item is meant to recharge, this will impose penalties on the two rolls for enchanting, as well as an increase in the cost of the spell to be stored, based on this chart. As you can imagine, this can get really costly really quickly. Let's look at one final example. Say we want to create a sword that shoots beams of fire from its blade. We can store the spell Invocation in it. To do that, we first perform the Arcanovi ritual, and after it's complete, we then roll for Invocation. Let's assume, against the absurdly unlikely odds, that our roll for this is identical to our earlier example, and we have 5 skill points left over after the casting, meaning that the skill rating for these stored spells is 5. If we want to store 2 charges of the spell into a sword, we'd have to spend a total of 24 arcane energy, 8 for Arcanovi, and 16 for 2 castings of Invocation. 2 of these points would be lost permanently. If we wanted to make this a recharging artifact that regains charges after 1 day, the cost would explode up to 600 arcane energy, 60 of which would be lost permanently. Naturally, this is not a task you could reasonably expect one person to perform. Ceremonies are the liturgical equivalent of rituals, and there isn't as many special rules for ceremonies as there are rituals, so they follow most of the same rules as rituals, which in turn use the rules similar to spellcasting, again an example of the rules building off of one another. The only thing worth noting here is that the chant bless item is not used to bless weapons. Instead, you would use the ceremony sanctify object. The benefit of sanctifying a weapon would be that it becomes a sacred item, and is thus capable of harming a demon normally. Or if the demon is opposed to the god it's sanctified by, it would deal double damage. One final thing to note is that some rituals and ceremonies can permanently reduce their arcane energy or karma points. The good news though is that each point lost this way can be regained at a rate of 2 adventure points per point lost. The bad news though is that these points need to be regained before your maximums can ever be raised. Here's a few other final considerations that don't really fit anywhere specifically. First, depending on what your magic tradition is, you gain special abilities in addition to spellcasting. Guild mages gain special abilities pertaining to magic staves, as well as the ability to learn spells from other traditions. Witches, on the other hand, gain familiars, special curses they can use, and also bonuses depending on if their emotions are in line with the desired result of the spell. And the Elven tradition, aside from being exclusive to elves, grants access to a few special rituals that gain bonuses based on their caster's singing ability, and if cast by an elf, the spells have twice the normal duration. The Blessed Ones have similar traditions, but they're a bit too numerous to concisely list. Another thing to note is that alchemy doesn't require any sort of magical ability, but it is easier for mages, who can spend arcane energy to gain bonuses to any rolls for preparing potions. Mages are also limited by what's called the Iron Ban. Every 2 pounds or so of iron on their person imposes a -1 penalty to their spells. The in-universe explanation is that iron repels magic. If the Iron Ban wasn't in place though, the only thing stopping mages from wielding heavier weapons than daggers and staves would be the local laws. By the laws described in setting, unless authorized by their guild or master, mages cannot wear armor or wield weapons. Blessed Ones, on the other hand, aren't necessarily forbidden from wielding heavy weapons. But unless they're a Blessed One of Rondra, it would be unusual for them to be swinging around a giant 2-handed sword. Speaking of Blessed Ones, if a Blessed One uses too much of their karma points at once, they wind up in a condition called Rapture. Rapture grants bonuses to any task relating to their god's aspect, but a penalty to literally anything else. So, to summarize, magic in the Dark Eye builds off of the skill system, and more complex subsystems are just further extensions of everything that's been established so far. Magic and Blessed One traditions grant various bonuses in addition to the ability to cast spells, depending on the tradition. And while they require different advantages and use different pools of resources, magic and liturgy are mechanically very similar, if not identical. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, give me one of those likes. And if you want to learn more about the Dark Eye or any other great but dense TRPGs, feel free to subscribe to my channel. And remember, videos on the internet are no substitute for reading your rulebook. So, with all that said, I am Aaron Darshadel, and I will see you all next time.